Hello and welcome to this episode of the podcast. I thought we should talk about late stage capitalism. Why, you may be asking? Well, in part because the word was bandied about. It was actually bandied about, I recall. Sorry, that's a bit of feedback. Episode of the podcast. That's me. I'm just checking. We're live. We're live. It was bandied about late state capitalism 2, 3 years ago, probably reached a bit of a frenzy. You could read about it on social media. The phrase was bandied about, and I never really quite knew totally what it meant. Sounded great in the sense that apocalyptic, foreboding, dangerous, and kind of catchy, but in a not good way. It didn't sound good. Well, unless you think capitalism is all wrong. And I think there's a lot wrong with capitalism, but the fact that something was going to come to an end, it was like in late stage, hold on a second, this sounds scary, this sounds frightening, this sounds worrisome, and so on. So recently, I've seen the phrase creep up in terms of where it's been written around me, things that I've been reading, again, comments, social media, and indeed in conversation. And so I thought, let's explore a little bit about what it is, and then also let us attempt to figure out if it is such a bad thing, what the solution may be. Now, I wrote a couple of scribbles down. And first of all, some people consider late stage capitalism to be connected to Marx and Marxism. And it wasn't Marx that coined the phrase. In fact, it was somebody called Warner Sombart, who was an historical economist, which is fine. And I believe it appeared in his book, Der modern Capitalismus. Der modern Capitalismus. Apologies for the pronunciation. And essentially, I'm just going to grab a little snippet here. It is suggested that the Sombart, again, apologies for that pronunciation, Sombart, he defined three periods of the capitalist economic system: early or proto-capitalism, advanced, and late. In Sombart's analysis, late capitalism referred specifically to economic, political, and social deprivations associated with the aftermath of the First World War. And so we can see where that came from. You can understand that this individual was looking at the horrible the outcomes of that war, and indeed the horrors within that war, and was reactive to that. And then capitalism, late stage capitalism, has begun to be defined as essentially the inevitable downfall of what is not in of itself a bad idea. This concept of the free market, of competition, of entrepreneurial activity. And when I've listened to people criticize capitalism, and then I think about those elements, I I find myself saying, well, that doesn't sound bad. I mean, the free market and competition and innovation doesn't sound bad. Of course, what can then happen is that those good elements, I would argue, of human nature. There's nothing wrong with competition as long as it's fair. There's definitely nothing wrong with innovation, at least innovation that isn't somehow robbing some individuals or poisoning rivers or whatever. So in of themselves, those things aren't bad. And so you look at it and you think, well, why the criticism? And what is wrong with the free market? Well, a couple of things, I guess, more than a couple. But one would be that if you do not have, if you're not the winner in that system, what are the safety measures? What's the safety net? How can we ensure that we care for those who fall through the cracks or aren't as successful or have that great invention, but it just doesn't take off at that point in time, or somebody steals the idea and so on. And you can begin to see how and why there are flaws in capitalism, and capitalism is incredibly flawed. But I'm not going to finish up on hopefully on a low note, because if you look at the alternative to capitalism, this sort of Marxist approach, for me, that doesn't work. It has failed every single time. And yet, of course, I am probably like you and like an awful lot of people currently are or have been in the past, where we say to ourselves, why can't people just get along? Why can't we get along in peace and tranquility? And I think that is important to figure out. I don't think that the human race has figured that out yet in its entirety. There are some encouraging signs, but there are some awful things still going on. And why couldn't we just live in a commune where we bartered and traded, and somebody did this thing, and well, they gathered the crops and they tended to looking after the weak and the infirm, and that sort of trade-off. Everybody lived in harmony. And this is where the same issues that can impact capitalism ultimately impacted, and I think will continue wherever it is tried to impact Marxism, or I know it's not quite the same thing, but communism, because somebody somewhere realizes that you need to sort of legislate and control, because who says, well, you give me the crops and you look after the weak and the vulnerable, but that I didn't feel that was fair. You know, I felt that I gave you a lot of crops and you're not doing much because everybody's healthy right now because of my great crops. So somebody somewhere's got to arbitrate, and yet then you can get into the wise people in the village and the hut that they can all sit in, the elders. That's in part why that clever system was there, is there. But when you begin to expand things out, and countries, of course, not just a village, but you have countries, you have counties even, then it can become an awful lot more complex and complicated. And I think that's because there's the capacity to find ourselves in situations that are so complicated that we need a level above to oversee, to have top-down authority. You might think, well, hold on a second. Is that communism? Is that Marxism? And are you advocating it? First of all, I wish we didn't need it, but I think we do. And I'll come on to where capitalism could be good and how it could be good. I'm not the first person to suggest what I'm going to suggest, but I have talked about it. I've talked about it to groups. I've written about it, and I believe that capitalism is better than the alternative, but not capitalism as we see it, and not in the late stage capitalism as I began to talk about a little while ago. But to finish off then with our analogy of living communally and having these disputes and having elders decide from the hut in the village, which works present day and did work in the past, when we grow in number, and there is not only just a country, but just even a county, then because things become more and more complex and complicated, you can see how the elders, the hut, needs to oversee more, and that then becomes an administration. And that's one of the issues that capitalism faces, and also communism, Marxism faces, because when you look at making everything equal and it's fair and it's a commune, then you need someone or some system to control it. And that's where greed, avarice, hubris, and other things can come into play. In other words, we can find ourselves in situations where, and I'm thinking here more communism, there is a group who pulls more and more power up. And to keep you safe, to keep things okay, to keep things fair, we'll tell you what to do. And because of the tendency that some people have when they get into power, or perhaps before then, when they want that power, they can become a little bit dictatorial. And people can begin to be censored and live in fear. And perhaps the issue with Marxism, and I know it's not quite the same, people can correct me, of course, but I'm admitting to the fact that I'm putting two things together that aren't totally the same, but I'm sort of putting them in the same basket for the sake of brevity here. So Marxism, communism, that one of the issues can be that power then stifles so many things. It can stifle, to a degree, innovation. People can begin to live in fear. They're cowed, they're worried about stepping out of line, about being not part of that commune. But the commune, of course, can be dictated by a very, very, very powerful few. So, yeah, I think, like many of us, it would be a lovely thought to be able to survive and thrive and be protected in a complex and complicated world where we could just do that. We could just live in peace. But unfortunately, the way these things tend to go, in my opinion, probably because of economies of scale, then more and more power gets pulled to the top. And because some, but not all, but often a lot of the people who are there can experience that rush to the head of power, and to keep you safe will control you more and more and more and more. And to keep us safe, we give away more and more and more. And that control system can get tighter and tighter and tighter, where speech and whatever we're allowed to say or not can become extremely restricted, which of course can clamp down on innovation and therefore ultimately possibly the economy, unless there are a huge amount of natural resources there. So as an idea, it's not a bad idea. It's a good idea. It can be attractive to many people. In practice, it fails, and probably will always fail because of those aspects of human nature, like greed, like that lust for power. So that's communism stroke Marxism. Again, very broad brush description. And also, of course, some people suggest that, hey, it will work. We just haven't quite found the right place for it. I'm not sure about that at all. Not in the slightest. And so it's a nice thought, but it's not one that I'm convinced of. I don't think I will be convinced, but let's somebody come up with a great example. Maybe that would be a good starting point. Then, what about capitalism? Well, this is the issue, and ironically, capitalism and late stage capitalism is that it is the same thing in many ways, because in that communal system that goes wrong, with the power and the control flows to the top to flatten everything out, then in capitalism gone wrong, run by greed and power crazed individuals, then the money, the resources, the contacts, the opportunities get pulled ever further upwards towards an elite. towards a bunch of elite individuals. And what we see now are, of course, well, it's finance, isn't it? It's money. Doesn't mean to say everyone who has money is like that, not at all. But more and more and more financial control, more and more control by big corporations. I was going to say copulations, I don't know why. That's an illegal merger, isn't it? Or a monopoly. But anyway, ignore I said that. So these big corporations who may be trying to something us, perhaps that was the Freudian slip, those big corporations can be corrupt, can be infused with greed. And then what happens? We can find that hegemony, that monopolistic attitude takes over, and that rapaciousness can cause, alongside a lot of other things, an element of, let's say, well, not only greed, but in actual fact, a zone of zero morality. There are no morals. It is all about money. It is all about gaining control through contractual arrangements, takeovers, mergers, whatever it may be. And that is the absolute ugly side of capitalism. And hence, we need some kind of safety net. And when people think about that, and they think about the greed of capitalism, and then they look at the safety net, then they think, well, hold on a second, what about more of those social models, and I suppose our language, more left wing, left leaning approach towards socialism, which of course has a huge attraction. And I think an awful lot of us, a lot of us are seeing right now people who're still really quite left leaning, but may be called right wing or centre right, because things have become muddied. And I hope to shine some light on that in terms of my little torch, dim as it is, that light that I might shine on it. In other words, I'll give you my opinion. And before I do that, let me then focus a little bit on the left, because I think it's fair to say that if you go too far with that left model, where everybody's got to be equal and everything's got to be the same, then you can see how there could be a tendency, as we have seen in some countries, for that to end up as communism, where the power and the control is at the top. And it's all about to keep you safe, don't do this, don't do that. And it's one of the reasons when we look at some left-wing, extremely left politicians, that it can seem restrictive. It probably is. And some of those people go in with good intention. But once more, when you have to create a system to control the village, because the village is now not just a county, but a country, then corruption and a disconnection between the population and those in power can occur, just as it can occur in capitalism when it goes wrong, because that sense of them and us, that sense of the elite, those in power, those making the decisions, those who seem to have no regard for the population, can happen in capitalism. And to confuse things perhaps even more, you can have people who are kind of left-leaning in a system that is capitalistic in nature and enjoy the trappings of power that them and us, whilst decrying the very system that gave them the trappings that they enjoy right now. So when we then consider capitalism and late stage capitalism through that lens, then I think this is it. This is why it can go wrong. So we have the free market, we have innovation, we have a push towards excellence, which is, I believe, all healthy. But it doesn't become healthy when there's no safety net for people. And it doesn't become healthy when the corporations are infused with greed. And the politicians, for that matter. And they're in league. I'm not saying they are. I'm saying, and some of them may be in league and I'm not talking specifically about any country here, are in league with these big corporations because they've got so much clout, because it is to do with greed and it's to do with influence, and it's the, hey, listen, I'm gonna ask you to put a question in about this. I'm gonna ask you to look favorably on our organization, and in return that will happen. And so we have those levels, light to awful levels of corruption. And a light level of corruption is still corruption, by the way. And so, what is the answer? I don't think it's communism. And I don't think it is capitalism that is controlled by rapacious corporations and individuals. So, there's also someone, I'm not the only person who's talked about this for sure, and I'm going to quote, there's a guy called Colin Mayer who's written about capitalism and crisis. And essentially, he's written more than one book, by the way, and essentially he suggests, and I'm paraphrasing a lot, that you need that top down. So remember the village and the elders, and we said you need something to control something, particularly when it's bigger than a village, a county, a country. So you need that control system. And that control system, of course, can be a government. That control system can also be organizations. In other words, they control product, they control release dates, they control updates, they control the quality. But there's also competition. So that could be healthy, particularly when the consumer, that would be us, has a voice and is prepared to say what they want. Because if we've got greed from corporations, if we've got greed from individuals within those corporations, who helps fuel that? Us, unfortunately. Not all of us, and sometimes absolutely not wittingly, but we do. If we want ever cheaper goods, if we want the convenience of something arriving on our doorstep like that, then there is a price to pay. And that price can be that we have huge organizations, way too big probably, that are unchallenged. And also we have cutthroat policies behind the scenes in terms of what is being destroyed, the environment and people. Low wages, horrible working conditions, using labour from other countries because it's cheaper, but those people are working in disgusting conditions. So we partly have a role to play. We partly have a role to play to say, do we need all this stuff? And do we need it as often? And also, who are these businesses and who are these leaders that we're dealing with, that we're interacting with in terms of the commercial life that we have out there, those interactions. But we also have political interactions, do we not? We have interactions with those people who are in power, governments and councils. And we have a voice there as well. And so I think that what we have to do is to consider that when something gets corrupt, whether it's a communist dictatorship or whether it is capitalism gone wrong, there is greed involved. There's power. There is a them and us mentality. There is a look down your nose. And what would be the solution to that? Well, again, there are many solutions, but one of the solutions would be morals. And this is actually what Colin Mayer suggests, that whilst you need that top down, so we need it, we need some mechanism. We need economies of scale to a degree. We need a government that can function to oversee certain approaches to certain things, whether it be defence or whatever. So we need that. But we need morality in there. We need leaders, we need corporations and leaders within those corporations and leaders within governments who are moral. This is an argument I've made for a long, long time, because I think at its core, this is what is missing. We need enough of them, of course, that a tipping point is reached so that the system itself is disinfected. by sunlight or whatever, so that it becomes the norm. It becomes what we would all like, that idea of, gosh, I can't believe someone did that to me. Well, okay, how are we behaving? Are we behaving in a way that actually we would like to be treated? And if we could get people, more people, I should say, because there are people there already, if we could get people in these corporations, in government positions who were moral and ethical, but people can follow the ethics book to a degree to get what they want, but there's no core of morality. I consider that to be something that is within us, that we feel and that we care about. If we have people who are moral in nature, then imagine the changes that would bring if we have enough of them. A corporation that had a conscience. Capitalism with conscience. I've heard that phrase before. But we need leaders within there, individuals within there, to speak up and say, this isn't right, this is wrong, I'm not happy with that. And we need to help support those people to get them into those positions of authority in organizations. So people like HR have a role to play. The existing shareholders have a role to play. The existing CEOs have roles to play to ensure that succession and recruitment and promotion follows morality, follows the moral compass. And in terms of politicians, we have to demand that they are moral. We have to demand that who we appoint, we have to get a fair understanding of what they believe. And I'll come back to that in a moment. I'll finish off with the politicians. So what have we got so far then? I don't think communism works. It's failed every time. I can't really think of a model where it would work, because it has the capacity to attract the wrong people who want to control rather than understand that they're to serve. If we then think about capitalism, the free market, the competition, innovation, these are good things. And if they are there and they're done in a fair and equitable way, then I think we're on to a winner. The problem is who controls, just like communism, who is there. And I believe with capitalism with a conscience, not late stage capitalism where everything's sucked to an elite and they look down on us, and we can sort of see some of that around right now. But unlike too far into communism, I don't think we're too far in terms of our capitalistic, let's say, environment right now. I don't think we're too far into that. Things can be challenged. We're still able to challenge peacefully, legally. We can challenge and we can demand. So in terms of the corporations, more transparency. More transparency, you could think 2 or 3 years ago. We didn't get enough. I said it at the time. I knew it at the time. Other people knew it, but we were not getting it. So we could see some greed at work there. Let me put it that way around. But more transparency. And it's up to us to say, well, I don't actually need to go and get that latest technical device. I don't want to name any names, because a lot of these organizations are at it. And if we do want it, is it a need? Is it actually something we need? And within reason, I don't want to make everything somber, but and how was it made? How was it sourced? Who are you employing? Who are you using to get those goods and services and products to us? They have to be transparent, these corporations. We have to ask questions, and we're going to have to walk away. If we see that they are just unethical, they're not moral at all, in terms of here, the capitalist corporations, we have to walk away, however tough that may be. Otherwise, we're just perpetuating it. Or at least not use them as much, and demand transparency, because we need to know what's going on. We need to know what's going on because we need to understand how moral they are, and not, of course, to fall for. I think we're all getting wise to it these days. The sound bites and the fancy adverts with, without AI generated nonsense that isn't real at all to try and convince us. We need transparency. Same then to come back to politicians. We've got the situation where in the UK, Prime Minister's questions, there's rarely an answer, a direct answer. It's a lot of nonsense. That needs to be changed. We should demand it. If we look at also in terms of the UK, the promises that were made before an election, as I understand it, and I could be wrong, I don't think they have to keep those promises. And if they do have to keep those promises, then what we saw was recently someone, a party and a leader not keeping a lot of the promises and blaming something. So we have to find a way to tie that down, to make people who are running for office accountable to what they said they were going to do. And yes, of course, I understand that force majeure can kick in, but it is out with the wit of mankind to find a way to say, here's the broad parameters. This is what you promised. If this, and this were to happen, then okay, fair enough. That was not in your control. But beyond that, you will be removed from office, and your sidekick, your second in command, will be put in place. And if you all continue to do that as a party or a group or a leadership team, you're out. And then, of course, that would cause turmoil, wouldn't it? But the alternative, 4 years, well, less these days in the UK, but counting down, 3, with a bunch of people who seemed not to have understood what the mission was, and seem to have been conservative. Well, that'll sting, describing you that way, won't it? But you are conservative with the truth. This is a nonsense. So we also have to demand more there. Peacefully, again. Legally, again. It doesn't mean to say quietly, but peacefully, legally. Because the power is with us, ultimately. It's important to remember that this is all by consent. And if we say this isn't good enough to whatever corporations, to whatever nonsense is going on out there in terms of the people they're using to create certain goods and services, walk away. Politicians, walk away. It's the old joke, don't vote for them, it just encourages them. Well, a lot of people didn't vote for this crowd, and of those who did vote, a lot of them are bitterly disappointed because we've been let down. A lack of understanding of self and others, it would seem. That's another story. Let me not veer off into that today. But certainly, to me, these are not moral leaders. There's a lack of morality. And no matter how much you try and convince yourself otherwise, then I think you're kidding yourself on. Maybe you are, and you're looking around. I don't know quite who you'll be speaking to here, but maybe you are as part of that team, that leadership team in the current government in the UK right now. Then what are you going to do? If it's all wrong and you know it's wrong, what are you going to do? Because you need to do it, and you need to do it now. Easy to say, but I've walked away from things. I've spoken out in the past. It does cost. It does cost you. It can cost you financially, and it can cost you in terms of not being part of that merry little clique. But do you know what? Your conscience is a lot clearer. So we need people to be moral, or at least to act in alignment with what they know to be morally correct, and not say, oh, I'll just pay the mortgage this month and I'll deal with that next month. Because you know what? Next month comes and goes, and then it's a year, and then it's 3 or 4, and then you haven't done anything. And this is what I think people have woken up to. So the antidote to late stage capitalism, in my opinion, and I think I'm right in paraphrasing Colin Mayer, is morality. It is that. It's for corporations to be populated by moral leaders. It's for all of us to define when we don't actually need something and when it's just a want, walk away from these greedy corporations, and ultimately who are polluting, of course, and destroying a lot of the natural environment. Again, another story. And also ultimately with politicians. This is why Labour in the UK are being punished in the polls. It's one of the reasons that Reform are doing well in the polls. But make no mistake, the same rules apply to Reform. And if you, in the unlikely event any of you listen to this, see this, then same rules, as I've said, same thing. We need leaders, parties, corporations, political leaders who are moral. And what was that? What's that? That phrase from, I think it was, yeah, Gladiator, the movie, that I find myself quoting from occasionally these days. I wonder why. And I believe it is Marcus Aurelius talking to Maximus about Marcus Aurelius's son, Commodus. And he says, Commodus is not a moral man. I believe that was the phrase. The question is, as we look around, who's Commodus